8 to 13-year-olds go through, and helping you to understand your child's behaviour a little bit more. So what I would do if we were all together and I was running a workshop and I had lots of parents of, or nearly 8-year-olds or 8 to 13-year-olds, and actually a few teens as well, because what I'm going to talk about in this video actually covers, I think, all the way through to sort of 18 or 19 years of age. So whether I was talking to parents or tweens or teens, or even those who teach them, so school teachers and the like, what I would do if we were all together is I would ask everybody in the audience, what sort of issues do parents or carers struggle with teenagers, with our 8 to 13-year-olds, or even those a little bit older or those a little bit younger, but that sort of ballpark. What are the sort of the common issues that people really struggle with at this age? And every time I do this, you know, I've run this many times in person as a talk or a workshop, and these always come up. And I think generally this can be summed up where people just say attitude, but ignoring instructions and requests. So if you ask them to do something, the fact that they just blatantly ignore you, or they do acknowledge you, but they still don't do what you've asked them to do. So if you're asking them to stop doing something, or if you're asking them to do something, the fact that they just tend to ignore you or just sort of look at you blankly or say yes, but still don't do it. This is probably, I would say, the top issue that parents and carers of tweens and teens struggle with. The fact that, you know, how do you communicate? How do you get them to do anything? Closely followed, the next two is laziness and messiness, particularly if we're talking about bedrooms. I don't know if you remember what your bedroom was like when you were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, but mine was disgusting. You know, I really am very bothered by mess now I'm an adult. And actually, when I was younger, I much preferred things to be in order and tidy, but I just couldn't do it. I was naturally incredibly messy. And I really struggled, or should I say actually that my mother really struggled with me when I was a tween and teen, because my room was a disgusting pigsty of a mess. And I think, you know, it's maybe karma coming around to me. I should have probably said at the beginning, I actually have 4 teenagers. I have a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, a nearly 18-year-old, and a 19-year-old. So I have lived this for the last decade of my life. You know, I'm here as a parenting author, parenting expert, but actually I'm also speaking to you as a mum of 4 teenagers who, believe me, I don't think there's anything that I haven't experienced. But I think also we forget, we've all been this age ourselves. You know, we all know what it's like to be the tween with the difficult behaviour. But the laziness and the messiness, so the things like, you know, could you help to tidy away after dinner? Could you, like if you've been in and had a shower, can you pick the wet towel up off of the floor? Can you pick your dirty socks off and not leave them by the front door and actually put them in the laundry basket? That sort of thing, that's what we're talking about. And then the third thing that is always at the top, combined actually, the stubbornness and the defiance that, you know, no, I'm not doing it. And just, what do you say when they turn around and say, no, I don't want to? When they're not little anymore and they're as big as you, or maybe even bigger if they're older. And then the back chat and the rudeness, you know, gone is your sweet little toddler or preschooler who just confessed undying love for you at all times and drew you letters that said, I love my daddy, or my mummy is so beautiful, I love her so much. You know, where did that child go? Now you've got a child who says quite hurtful things to you, or things that, you know, make you really question what you've done wrong bringing them up, or if they still love you. So, you know, what's happening there? There's this back chat, and there's just like deliberate disrespect and rudeness. So these are probably combined into the stubbornness and the back chat and the rudeness all into one. These are definitely the top 3 issues when I speak with parents and carers at this age range. But what else? So the only thing that they struggle with, you know, do you not find it really strange? When I was writing Between, thinking, why is there not many books about this age range? Why aren't there parenting courses and classes everywhere about this age range? Why are there not parenting magazines about this age range? You know, when you're pregnant or you have a baby, there's so many magazines and websites and books and courses, and there's so much help and information out there. And then I think your child maybe turns 4 or 5 and everybody seems to think that you know what you're doing. Like you're a pro at parenting, you've got it nailed, you don't need help anymore. And all the websites disappear, all the books disappear, all the courses disappear, all the magazines disappear, and you are totally on your own. And for me, I think it was actually the time that I needed it most. I remember, sorry, I've gone off on such a segue, but let me carry on. But when my daughter was hitting puberty, so she was about 8 or 9, and I was frantically having to Google, what happens in puberty and when, and thinking, this is insane. Why do we not all know this? Why are we not all properly taught this at school? Why is there only parenting info and support for pregnancy, birth, babies and toddlers, and then it falls off a cliff edge? But anyway, let's pick up where I was ended from. What else do we struggle with? Sibling rivalry and fighting that maybe kind of ramps up a gear a little bit. So we've not got the kind of the sweet little bickering that when you've got a 2 and a 3-year-old, you've got the, lots of swearing, maybe a bit of violence, that or just constantly bickering with each other. The procrastination, particularly with homework. So if you have a child at mainstream school, this is the age that homework really starts to set in, particularly when they're 11 and they head out to high school or secondary school. You'll start to really see homework setting in. And one of the common questions I get asked is, how do you get them to do their homework? How do you get them to do their homework without having to constantly be on their case about it? And then you've got the impulsive, silly behaviour. So the behaviour that's quite sweet, but also can be quite dangerous. So here, I think, a really good thing to think about is if you've ever seen the series, The In-Betweeners. So The In-Betweeners is actually about teenage boys, but actually the crazy behavior in that series is so true when we think about the brain development of tweens and teens. So the silly, but sometimes dangerous, sometimes really disrespectful, sometimes harmful behavior, that there's no malice behind it, but they just do these silly things that often get them or other people into trouble. And then screen time addiction. I'm not going to touch on this today because that's a whole hour in itself, but it's something that really crops up again and again. There's a little bit when we talk about the brain that will help you to understand why it's such an issue. But if you did want more on screen time addiction, then I definitely recommend checking out Between. There's a whole section on dealing with screen time in it. So let's think about maybe when we were tweens ourselves, and if we did something naughty or disrespectful, how would our parents treat us? What would happen to us? What sort of discipline would we receive? Or maybe if you've been disrespectful or you hadn't done your homework or been naughty at school, what sort of things would have happened to you at school? So just, have a little bit of a revisit of your own tween years and think about the discipline techniques that were used on you. And now think about the discipline techniques that we're advised to use with tweens today. So if they do something rude or naughty or disrespectful, whether it's at home or at school, what are the most common discipline or parenting techniques used today and advised by, if you do manage to get some tween parenting advice, what sort of thing are you recommended to do with them, particularly if you go on to sort of parenting discussion groups on Facebook or something like that. So if you have, say, a 10-year-old who's done something that's deemed rude or naughty or disrespectful, what are we commonly advised to do, or what would have happened to us at that age? So being sent to your room, that was a big one for me. If I did or said something wrong, I'd be off to your room, go to your room, stay in your room, and you think about what you've done, and we come down with some respect, but sending them away from us. So there's the separation of us and them, not because we need necessarily some time for them to calm down. That's something a bit different, but the sending them away in itself was meant to be the punishment. You're not allowed to be with the family tonight, go away. I'm going to skip the next one because it's about school and we'll come back to that. Consequences, such a huge one. I'm not going to go into depth about consequences here, but if you are interested in consequences as a discipline tool and where it fits into a more gentle or respectful style of parenting, please go check my YouTube channel, and I have a video about consequences. Just Google my name and consequences and it will come up, because there's so much misunderstanding about it. But so the consequences I'm talking about here are when children have things taken away. So there are two things they have taken away: their freedom or their free time. So if we're talking about school, their free time with detention, or their freedom maybe when they're sort of getting towards the teen years, so the 13-year-olds, maybe the 14-year-olds, when they get grounded or whatever it's called these days. But also actually taking things away. So the common thing to take away here would be their screens, like their Xbox or their PlayStation, or taking away privileges and sort of activities. So taking away a sleepover they were having with their friend or something like that. But the idea here is that when the child is naughty or misbehaved or disrespectful, is that we take something away from them. That's the consequence of their behaviour, because then it will make them behave better. At least that's the thought. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. We're also commonly advised to ignore the bad behaviour. So very often we'll hear advice such as they're doing it to get attention. If you don't give them attention, they'll stop doing it. So ignoring when they're rude to you, just totally ignore it, totally blank them, don't listen to them. On the reverse side, praise them when they're good. If they do something well, heap the praise on, tell them that you're really pleased with them. This advice is the most common if you do manage to get on a parenting course for this age. So particularly one you would find, run by sort of a local council or a local state or something. This is the sort of advice you get in those parenting courses. They ignore the bad behaviour, praise the good behaviour, and use consequences. The other thing that's recommended is that if they do something good, as well as heaping on the praise, we reward them. So for instance, if they won't do their homework, if they do their homework every day for a week, you give them some money, or you take them to a theme park, or you buy them something. And if they do really well at school and get a good report for the term, then you buy them something there. So we're rewarding when they're being good. When they're doing the thing we want them to do, we put lots of rewards on them so that we make them feel good for being good and bad for being bad. Makes sense, doesn't it? We'll come back to that in a little bit. What about if they're at school? So at this age range, particularly once they're starting high school and secondary school, which happens slap bang in the middle of the tween years at age 11. So what you will commonly find if they've been difficult at school is there will be things like detention, where they will miss probably a lunch break and have to sit and write lines or do some homework or read a book or something. Or sometimes it will be an after school detention. But the idea is that they're excluded from their peers. They're excluded from the fun and relaxation of lunchtime or after school. Sometimes they will be isolated if their behaviour is deemed worse than that. So schools will often have an isolation room or an isolation booth. The idea there is a bit like solitary confinement in prison, that if a child has been naughty, that you put them in isolation and then they spend half a day, maybe a whole day, away from their peers. They're normally escorted to get food or escorted to go to the loo by a teacher. And it really is just isolating them from their peers. And then the final step there will be exclusion, where the child will either be temporarily excluded or suspended from school, or permanently excluded, or just made to leave the school. The other thing schools do on the flip side, so you've got the punishments on the one hand, the other thing they do is to reward children. So again, lots of rewards. You'll get head teachers awards or rewards. They award everything from attendance to how well children have behaved in school reports, and there'll often be certificates, head teachers awards, things like that. So they're very much focusing on the punishing the bad behaviour and rewarding the good. So we're falling back, or sometimes ignoring the bad behaviour, but less so, I think, in a school setting. So what I want you to do is to think about, I'm not going to say anything for sort of 30 seconds or so. What do all of the techniques that I've just discussed with you have in common? And if anybody can think of an answer, do pop it in and I'll have a read. What do they all presume about the child? What are they all focused on changing? So what do these techniques have in common? Why do parents, the schools, anybody who recommend, why do we think these are going to work? What are they going to change? What is the focus of these techniques? Okay, somebody said that they want to change behavior. Yeah, they do. But what is it that they're trying to change or work on in order to change the behavior? So the end result is we want to change the behavior, but every technique focuses on changing one thing, just one word. Getting lots of words. Nobody's got that one word yet. Yeah, okay. So a good, well done to Jenny, who has said the word is motivation. So what do these techniques all have in common? They all focus on motivation. Every single one of the techniques that I've just discussed presumes that the child can do better. They have just chosen not to. So every single one of the techniques that I've just mentioned focuses on the fact that the child has made a bad decision. They've made a bad decision to misbehave. They've made a bad decision to be disrespectful. They've made a bad decision to be silly. They've made a bad decision to not listen. But every single one of those techniques presumes that it's the motivation that's the problem. So therefore, all you need to do is to demotivate the child away from this difficult behavior by punishing them, or by excluding them, or by shaming them, or by taking something away from them. Or you motivate them to do better by praising them, rewarding them, giving them certificates, giving them awards, heaping on the attention. Every single one of these techniques believes that every difficult behavior in the tween years is because the child has made a bad decision, but the child is capable of doing better. They just haven't. So every single technique focuses on demotivating or motivating. So what's the presumption behind that then? The presumption is that every single child is capable of doing better. They've just chosen not to. But what if I say one thing to you? What if they can't do better? What if the reason that they've behaved like that is because they're unable to behave better? What will motivation do then? If they're incapable, if they didn't make a bad decision, there was no conscious decision, that was just how they behaved, what is discipline based on motivation going to do then if they are incapable of behaving better? Keep that thought in mind as we move on. So the problem is not motivation. It's also not their hormones. This is such a huge bugbear of mine. So I have two bugbears about hormones. The first, which is slightly unrelated, but it always helps me to have a ventilator, so I'll talk to you about it now. Boys do not have a testosterone surge at the age of 4 years of age. Please. No, it physiologically just does not happen. Testosterone actually peaks post-birth, like in the first couple of days in a newborn baby. And then it will drop. And then it will stay pretty statically low until 10, 11, when it starts to rise at puberty. So a 4-year-old boy or a 5-year-old boy is definitely not behaving in a difficult way because of testosterone. There is no such thing as a testosterone surge in young boys. Please remember that. Very off topic, but important, I think, to before we move on, because the second time that we blame behavior on hormones is puberty. So if it may not happen to a 4-year-old boy, surely when a child is going through puberty, it's because of their hormones. And I cannot tell you how many times I hear this from parents and carers. So if somebody posts a question on an internet discussion forum, oh, my 9-year-old girl is being really, really rude or disrespectful, or my 11-year-old is just being really difficult, really boisterous, really naughty. What's the first response going to say? It's going to say, I hear you. It's their hormones. Their hormones are going haywire. It's their hormones. It's not their hormones. It really, really, really is not their hormones. We blame way too much behavior on hormones. Even with ourselves, you know, for women particularly, you get, oh, it's the time of the month. And so hormones can affect behavior. And yes, they do have an increase of hormones at puberty, which happens around about the age of 10 or 11. So if you have a 7 or 8-year-old, definitely nothing to do with hormones, unless there's a rare condition called precocious puberty, which is rare, and I speak about it in the book. It's something I myself experienced, but that is the exception to the rule. What we see from hormones actually is the one most common behavior is testosterone can affect something called risk-taking behavior. So higher levels of testosterone can make kids make more risky decisions, but you tend to see that more with teenage boys. But actually, it's a very small thing compared to the real cause of their difficult behavior, which is not their hormones and not their motivation, but their brain. Which is why today I've chosen to call this webinar Understanding the Tween Brain. Because to be honest, if you understand nothing else about tweens apart from their brains, then it's almost all you need to know to parent them or to raise them. I'm just going to check and see if there's anything urgent that's coming before I carry on. Okay, carry on. So what do we need to understand about tween brain? Obviously, really short webinar, so I'm going to give you a really, really quick overview here. The easiest way that I find to understand and explain brain development in childhood is by using something called the triune brain theory by a man called Paul MacLean. So it's not as simple, but it's a nice, easy way to understand it. So basically, MacLean said the brain is divided into 3 sections: the reptilian complex, the limbic system, and the neocortex. So if you look at the side of the screen where it's pointed to the inside of the brain, the base of the brain and the brain stem, this is basically the part of the brain that's responsible for homeostasis. It keeps us alive, it regulates our breathing and our temperature and everything else. It's basic survival. So this is really well formed at birth, obviously, because it needs to be. So we've got this well-formed reptilian complex. And then we have the mammalian system, the limbic system. And this is all about emotions and love and bonding and sort of anxiety when we're separated. So obviously it's really important for babies to have a well-developed limbic system or mammalian system, because they're needing to bond with their caregivers. They need to have separation anxiety at night to keep them safe. So these are well developed. So basically what you have is a brain that's full of big emotions. But then because we're adults, we come along and we can put a lid on this emotion. So we have this part of our brain, the frontal neocortex. This is the really intelligent, thinking, mature part of our brain. This is the last part of the brain that connects up together. So essentially what you have as an adult is you have your well-developed brainstem, you have all your big feelings, your emotions, but then you have the neocortex. It's also well connected. And that acts as your lid almost. So if you have all these big bubbling emotions, you have this mature lid that can metaphorically keep a lid on it and say, no, it's inappropriate to have a tantrum in the middle of Tesco's or Walmart or whatever. So even though you feel like shouting and screaming, you know it's inappropriate to do so. It's also inappropriate to shout and swear in the middle of a work meeting because otherwise you'll be fired. So you're lucky we have a well-developed neocortex that can metaphorically keep a lid on all these big bubbling emotions. So if I was talking to you about toddlers, what I would be saying here is they have well-developed reptilian complex, well-developed mammalian system, because boy, do toddlers have big feelings, but toddlers don't have a well-developed neocortex. Literally, a toddler is like a pot of water full to the brim on a stove, electric gas stove, whatever type of stove you have, on a cooker, on a hob, whatever you refer to it as. And it's full to the brim of stuff. And it's starting to bubble over. And what happens with a toddler is you have all these explosions of the water boiling over, but they don't have the neocortex. They don't have the rational thinking part to put a lid on it or to think, aha, I need to solve the problem. So I need to turn the gas or the electric down. So you just have this big exploding mess. So that is a really good way to explain a toddler tantrum. Toddlers aren't deliberately naughty. They literally have an underdeveloped neocortex. With tweens, and particularly with teens, if you have older children, we tend to think that they are very mature and very like us. And actually, it's really difficult when you have tweens, or teens if they're older, and they are as tall as you, or even taller than you. And then when they get older and they start to have body hair and their voices drop, and it's, you know, you have these big adult-looking creatures suddenly in the place where your toddler used to be, you know, blinked overnight, and there they are. So we would be mistaken of thinking that actually their brain is more like ours because they look like us. No, their brain is very, very similar to that of a toddler. Their brain doesn't develop that quickly. So if you think about that toddler brain of being all these big bubbling emotions, and they have like an underdeveloped center of logic and rational and concrete thinking skills, what we call very mature thinking skills and emotion regulation skills, they literally just, you know, whatever comes to their mind comes out, and they think about the implications of it later, not because they're naughty, but because their brain isn't finished connecting and developing yet. So they are lacking a good amount of connection and development in this part of the brain, the frontal lobe of the brain, which is responsible for the mature and adult things. And actually, even as adults, we still struggle sometimes. But your tween is much like they were as a toddler. They are a pot full of bubbling emotions who are incapable of turning down the gas or putting the lid on. But they look older. So an analogy I use in between is it's a little bit like your toddler has now grown into a tween, and they are now a big sports car. They've gone from like a little riding cozy coupe car to being like looking like a Lamborghini. But inside they have the brakes of a 30-year-old Mini and the steering of one as well. They literally do not have the control to match their outward appearance. So with that in mind, what should we expect of their behavior? Well, I've given you a clue when I said basically expect them to act more like a toddler than an adult. But what should we expect specifically? Well, empathy, understanding how other people think and feel. So we know empathy is pretty well developed by about the age of 4 and 5. So you may then be mistaken of thinking, well, surely they just keep getting more and more empathic, particularly if I've been really kind and gentle and respectful towards them and showed them lots of empathy. Therefore, they're going to be great at empathy and show it back to me and be really kind and respectful towards me. So yes, theoretically, but what you don't know is in the tween and teen years, they have something called an empathy deficit. So if we were talking about toddlers and we were talking about sleep, I think we all understand that sleep doesn't just go upright, goes up and down, and we have sleep regressions, where your tween or teenager has an empathy regression. It's not a problem. It's nothing you've done wrong in your parenting. It's actually a really, really vital part of their development. Why do they need to regress in levels of empathy? Simply because the tween and teen years are all about them. It's all about, I'm getting some autonomy from my parents. It's all about thinking about who I am outside of my family, learning about my identity and who I am and what I like and who I want to be and who I want to be with. Who am I? If we could sum up the tween years in 3 words, I think who am I is how we could do it. So if they're focusing on who am I, separate from you, it makes sense that they have less empathy for other people, because it's quite hard to be very introspective and very focused on ourselves if we're constantly worried about other people and how they feel and what they think about us. So nature is very clever, and they have a bit of an empathy deficit. It doesn't last. I mean, it does last for several years, but your lovely empathic child will make an appearance again. Personally, for me, they come in at about 16 or so, and there's a lovely upward trajectory after that. You know, my 19-year-old is lovely, but definitely there's a real empathy drop in the tween and early teen years, because it's so, so important. It's nothing you've done wrong, and it is not permanent. What else? Concrete thinking, so the sort of abstract, hypothetical, logical thinking. So they're not very good at these in the beginning of the tween years. The 8 to 11 years, there's not a lot of logic or rational thinking or abstract thinking or hypothetical skills going on. They are very much focused on something that is tangible. But when they get older, sort of secondary school age, this is when they start to understand all of these a little bit more, but they're still not particularly great at rational thinking, certainly not when it involves a lack of emotion regulation. But I would expect a little bit more in an older tween and a younger teen than I would in a younger teenager. But the emotion regulation and the impulse control, I think, are the most important things here. So we already know they're not good at regulating their emotions. We already know they're a pot of bubbling emotions, and they struggle to put the lid on or turn the gas down. And certainly sending them to their room alone doesn't help them to regulate their emotions. Far from it. What it does is kind of gets them to push or shove their emotions down. So you may get compliance in that they stop showing their emotions around you. And that may seem good when you're shattered at being a parent of a tween. But if you think about the long-term implications, if you teach your tween now to bury their big, difficult feelings because they're too difficult or unpleasant or, you know, just a not good time for us to handle them right now if they're inconvenient for us, what we don't want to do is teach them to go and sit in their room and keep those all in, because what we then do is we teach them when they're a teenager or a younger adult that if they have these really big, difficult emotions, that we don't want them to come to us with them. What we really want to do is to raise an older teenager or a younger sort of 20-year-old who, when they have trouble, can come say, Mum, Dad, I'm really struggling at the moment. Can we talk about it? So I know it's really difficult right now when they struggle to regulate their emotions, but the best thing we can do is to be with them and say, you know, I'm big enough, I'm adult enough that I can deal with it. You know, I'm not going to focus on the words you're using, however rude or triggering they may be to me. What I'm going to do is see a child who's struggling with their emotions, who needs to borrow some of my adult regulation skills, because I want to keep that relationship open when they're older. Impulse control is a huge one. Impulse control is probably the last thing to develop in the brain. And we're talking about it develops in the 20s, not months, but 20 years. So remember when I spoke about the series, The In-Betweeners? If you haven't watched it, do watch it. It was just a great insight to what happens in the teen years. But impulse control, I think, is the thing that all tweens and teens are really bad at. And actually, we're not particularly good at it as adults either. But for the tweens and the teens, having, you know, trying to stop them from doing something that they really want to do and they know it's wrong, but they literally can't stop themselves doing it because, you know, the impulses are overwhelming. And, you know, they just do all these really stupid things. And once they've done them, they know they shouldn't have done them. There'll be regret. But it's just like they cannot get their brain into gear to stop them doing it. So one time I got called away. Actually, many times I've been called into school about my children, but one time I was with my eldest. He was then, I think he was about 12 or 13. And he got into trouble at school because he'd found a fork on the floor and he was scraping it up and down a metal table leg. And it was really, really annoying the girl next to him. And he also scraped the table leg. So I got called in because he'd been defacing school property. And the first thing that I do when I get called in school, if there's an issue with my kids' behaviour, is I ask them why. For me, it makes no sense to punish them if they've done something wrong, if I don't understand the reasons behind it. And I actually think anybody would ask him why at that point. But I said, why did you do it? And he looked at me and said, Mum, I don't know. Like, sometimes my brain makes me do things and it's like I'm not in control of it, but my brain makes me do it. And I know afterwards I shouldn't have done it, but sometimes I just can't stop myself. And my brain made me do it. And I thought, actually, it was a really good way of explaining tween impulse control, or rather lack of it. They don't want to do these naughty or difficult or rude things. They don't want to upset us by the words that come out of their mouth. They just can't control it. They are all these emotions. They are conflicting thoughts and feelings, and they are a massive lack of impulse control. It's literally their brains make them do it. What else? So I'm going to skip circadian rhythms. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Perception of risk tends to be quite down in the tween and teen years. So what I always find really desperately sad, but also interesting, is when we're talking about children, giving children more control and freedom. And I'll often see discussions on sort of internet discussion groups saying, when would you let your child walk to or from school? And the most common response there is when they start high school or secondary school. So the presumption there being obviously that once they're 11, they're mature enough to do it. But actually, if you look at the statistics of road traffic accidents involving children, so children who are run over or involved in the accident, the most common time for it to happen is between the ages of 11 and 13 years. Because I think what happens is we think they're mature enough, we let them out, and actually this is when their perception of risk is so really is not in line with reality. Their perception of risk is lowered. It's actually safer for a 9 or 10-year-old to walk than an 11 to 13-year-old. But also we suddenly think that overnight they've matured enough because they've started secondary school that they let them out. But we haven't had the practice with them when they have better risk perception and better empathy and better connection maybe with us in the younger years. But the perception of risk is very skewed in the tween years. Particularly, this is the one, remember I said the one thing where hormones really impact. Raised levels of testosterone impact risk perception. So we know from research that boys are more likely to engage in risky behaviour than girls during puberty. Doesn't last, and obviously that builds in line as well with the more concrete thinking skills, the understanding cause and effect and ration and logic. But this is why if you're driving through your town or your village and it's it's school holidays or school kick out time, you'll see a group of kids and a bull will run in the road and they'll just run straight in the road after it, because there's this kind of almost perception that they're invincible and they don't think about the risk, not because they're silly, not because they've been brought up badly, because of their brains. So thrill seeking is in a sort of a similar vein as well. This is to do with sort of the receptors in the brain and how it makes us feel. So in the same sort of way that if we went to a theme park, we may be a bit of an adrenaline junkie and go on a roller coaster. They're seeking this thrill because of the chemicals in their brain. So that combined with risk taking can be quite tricky. And they also tend to seek the thrill of like novelty of doing new things. And they very much do first, think later. Again, it's not because of bad parenting or because of anything you've done wrong or any personality flaw they have. It's just their brains. They won't be like that forever, but temporarily they need a bit more scaffolding from us while they're going through it. The last thing here I think we should all understand more in our society is the fact that our circadian rhythm or our body clock changes once we go through puberty. So probably if you're tuning in and you have younger children, you're probably still being woken up at 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning. And what you will find as you get closer and closer to the teenage years is your child who you so desperately wanted to sleep past 6 a.m. in the morning is now an utter nightmare to get out of bed until 10 or 11 a.m. And I always think it's like, karma coming back to you after the toddler years, when you spent so long thinking, please sleep a little bit longer in the morning. And now you have this child who doesn't want to get up until lunchtime. And very often we blame it on them being lazy or unmotivated, and it isn't. It's because their body clock literally shifts. They have something called a circadian shift, which means that they need to go to bed later. So here's where the other difficulty comes in. When we still want them to go to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, but they are not physiologically ready to sleep until about 10 p.m. So what we need to do is to understand that they're changing as they're growing. shift bedtime a bit later. You know, it's great for a preschooler or a 5 or 6 year old to go to bed at 8, but our tweens need later bedtimes because they find it physiologically harder to get to sleep because their circadian rhythm has effectively moved them into a different time zone. But on the other end, they want to wake up later, not because they're not getting enough sleep, not because they're being rude, not because they're being lazy, but because their bodies make them physiologically ready to start the day after 9 a.m. which is nice temporarily because you start to get some lay-ins in the morning, but not great when you have to get them up and they're just a nightmare to get out of bed. And there's some really interesting research actually looking at circadian shifts. And if we started our school day 45 minutes, an hour later, we know from the research that academic achievement is better, behaviour is better. They're also involved in less road traffic accidents, whether they're pedestrians or they're driving a car themselves. You know, there's a very big body of research to suggest that we start school way too early for our tweens and teens, and they'd be much better to move it later. I don't know why we don't take this research on board. You know, it would be an incredibly positive thing if we did change it. It's there, the body of evidence is very convincing. It hasn't filtered through to policy. Maybe one day it will. But the circadian rhythm shift is very real, and it is not your child being lazy. So what else? I just want to leave you quickly with this quote before we move on to anything else, that kids do well if they can, by a man called Professor Ross Green, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard University. Honestly, this quote, I think, got me through the tween and teen years with my children. It's about focusing on the fact it's not them, it's their brains. It's not you either. It's nothing you've done wrong. It's, you know, nothing that you've passed on genetically. It's not a mistake that you've made. Kids do well if they can. If they're not doing well, there is a reason. So what do we need to do? We need to look for that reason. We need to be the Sherlock Holmes, or as I say in the between, the Hercule Poirot of our children. We look for the why. We find out, why are they not doing well? Why are they being disrespectful? Why are they bickering with their sibling? Why are they not doing their homework? Why are they not tidying their room? You know, there's always a why. Frustratingly, the why is sometimes because they're a tween with a tween brain. But sometimes the why is because they're feeling disconnected, because they're struggling at school, because they've got friendship difficulties, because I'm not explaining this very well, because they need more one-to-one time away from their sibling. You know, there's always a why. Sometimes the why is because they're a tween and you should not expect adult behavior from them. But look for the why. Going back to the idea of the motivation-based discipline, the motivating them with rewards and praise and stickers and achievement certificates, or the demotivating them with consequences and punishments and isolating and ignoring bad behavior, they can't help if the issue is the fact that they have a tween brain. In fact, all they do, whether you're looking at rewards or punishments, is punishing them to have a tween brain. If a tween doesn't have impulse control, it doesn't matter how many things you dangle in front of them as a carrot to reward them, you're not going to give them a brain of a 20-year-old. So what happens, effectively, you're punishing them because they can't get your reward, because what you're asking them to do is beyond the realm of capability that they have as a child. So what style of parenting or discipline is the most effective with tweens? Well, ultimately, it's the style that is informed and knowledgeable about their development and their capabilities. It's one that has a good understanding of normal child development. And yes, a tween and a teen is a child, regardless of what our society may think. An 18-year-old is technically an adult, but a 17-year-old and, you know, 364-day-old is still a child. And your tween is definitely a child still. We should understand how their brains develop. We should understand what they're capable of. We shouldn't take things personally. We should understand their capabilities cognitively, and we should set our expectations of their behavior, of their abilities, of their communication in line with what we know that they can do. What else? We need to have empathy and compassion for them. You know, we all know what it's like to have been there. We all know what it's like as a tween to be thoroughly misunderstood by our caregivers, by our parents or our teachers or whoever else it is. We all know what it feels like when you really needed something from them and instead you got punishment. We all know what it feels like when we need connection and understanding and support and we didn't get it. You know, you don't need me. Nobody needs people like me. If we could just go back inside and think of our own childhoods and how we felt at that time and what we needed of our caregivers, that's the best way we could respond to our children. but just having some empathy and compassion for them. Keep reminding yourself, kids do well if they can. If your child is not doing well, if they are rude or disrespectful or fighting or bickering or not doing something, they're not made a deliberate choice to be difficult. You know, they're just not doing well because something in their world is not right or it's difficult for them. In order to have respect from them, we need to be respectful to them. This is so simple, and way too many adults don't get this point. Adults tend to demand respect from kids, particularly tweens and teens. There is such a social misconception of tweens and teens. We look on them so very negatively. You know, I'm always seeing complaining posts about the youth of today on social media, and these are, you know, nasty, naughty children. Again, we forget that we are them, but actually the research shows that this current generation are probably the best generation there ever has been. You know, they're way more likely to have better behavior. They're way less likely to abuse drugs or alcohol. They're way less likely to smoke. They're way less likely to have teenage pregnancies. They're much more likely to achieve better academically. They're an amazing generation, and I really think we should celebrate them more. But we need to earn respect from them. We can't demand respect, and we definitely don't get respect through fear, what I call fear of God parenting. So fear of God parenting may work when they're smaller than us, but when they're the same age and you don't scare them anymore, really difficult, and it's definitely not the way that you get respect. Maybe you'll get short-term compliance if you do manage to scare them, but that's not the same as respect. To get respect from them, we have to respect them back. We need a good balance of control, so that means allowing for their growing autonomy and independence, but being there at times they need us to. Having clear boundaries that are respectfully enforced. So I don't mean being a pushover or raising a snowflake or being a hippie permissive parent. I mean we have boundaries and we have discipline, but we just reinforce them respectfully. But we do enforce them. It's really important that we have boundaries and limits and discipline, but we just do it from the position of understanding their capabilities and supporting them if they mess up. Because, you know, if we want them to come to us when they're a teenager and say, Mom, Dad, I messed up, can I have some help? We have to start by doing that when they're a teenager. So we need to allow them to experience the consequences of their behaviour safely in order to aid learning. Here I'm talking predominantly about natural consequences, which are things that happen naturally in the world that we have no involvement in. One thing that I'm very against is something called illogical consequences. So illogical consequences are things we impose that have absolutely no logical relationship between our action and the child's behaviour. So this will be something like, you were rude to your grandmother, therefore you don't have a birthday present. There's no logical link. It's a very, very poor form of discipline. Sometimes there's a logical consequence, which is where the child does something and the logical consequence of their behaviour is to do X, Y, Z to resolve the issue. But we just need to be very careful that we don't focus on consequences, because they should be a tiny piece of discipline. Keep them very much in the back of your mind. Here, what I mean is focusing more on allowing them to experience the natural consequences. So if they don't do their homework, what about if we don't chase them? What about if they experience the natural consequence of not doing it? If they're not revising for an exam, what about if we allow them to experience the natural consequence of not doing it? That feeling of sitting at the exam table, pen in hand, thinking, oh, I should have revised. I feel really bad. I've really messed up. You know, we tend to wrap our kids in cotton wool a lot and not let them experience the consequences of the world, but sometimes it's the very consequences that they need in order to learn and grow. But obviously we have to do that mindfully and safely. Most importantly, we need to be a good role model. We need to be the calm, kind, compassionate model of self-control that we want our children to be, which is really, really hard. I truly understand that. And, you know, I don't know who said it, but there's the phrase, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. When they're little, when you've got the sleepless nights and all the nappies and the toddler tantrums, life is physically draining. But my goodness, life is way more emotionally draining as you approach the tween and the teen years. And the bigger they are, the bigger their problems. Add to that, you're probably going through some sort of life transitions yourself at this age as you're approaching sort of being older and the sort of changes in life and pace of life that brings with it. And it can be really hard to stay calm and be a great role model. I don't have any magic words of advice that will change everything overnight, but just to say, I think one of the most important things we can do is think back to our own childhoods, think about how we were raised and what we deserved and didn't deserve as a child, and think about anything that triggers us with our own tweens based on how we were raised. So all too often, if our tweens speak to us disrespectfully, it's not us in the present moment responding, it's us responding when we were a 9-year-old and we said the same thing and we got a slap or we got yelled at. So we respond based on all of the subconscious memories that we hold for, we would have been smacked for that or sent to our room for that, or we would have had something taken away. So I can't possibly let my child get away with that level of disrespect. But actually now we know we have a better understanding. It's not disrespect. We can break the cycle. We don't have to continue to raise our kids in the same way that we ourselves were raised. But also, really importantly, we must understand the impact our own parenting had on us and how our tweens and teens can trigger things from us that are not about them at all, but more about how we were raised. So one of the best things I suggest people can do is just focus mindfully a little bit on their own upbringing and check in with their old 8, 9, 10-year-old self. I'm currently writing a book, actually, it's pretty much exactly about this and how to be calm, called How to Be a Calm Parent. It's out in, I think it's 7 months' time. But I know it doesn't help you right now, but I am really working on it, and I'm very, very excited at how it's going to be received, because I've been in a very big process myself in the last couple of years, and I think it's really helpful. But basically, we need to be a great role model. If we're shouting at our kids, if we're dysregulated, we teach them to be dysregulated. If we're disrespectful, we teach them to be disrespectful. So it's not even about what we do or even what we say to them. It's about what we're modeling. Are we modeling the calm and the respect and the empathy that we ultimately want from our children? If you're interested in what this style of parenting is called, it's called authoritative parenting. There's authoritarian parenting on one side, which is more kind of old school Victorian parenting, the do as I say, not do as I do type parenting. There's also permissive parenting, which a lot of people mistakenly think that's the sort of style that I talk about, or gentle parenting, respectful parenting, whatever label it has. A lot of people mistakenly think it's permissive, that style of parenting where kids just get away with everything. And that absolutely isn't it at all. I focus on a style called authoritative parenting, or commonly referred to as gentle parenting, which just sums up having understanding, having respect, having good expectations, but having those clear boundaries and that discipline, but being a great role model. So what is a great role model as a parent of a tween? We need to be as calm as possible, patient, respectful, good listener, inspiring, sense of humor and humility, be well informed about our subject. You know, if we were teachers, we would have a good level of knowledge about our subject, our tweens. We would understand what's going on inside their mind, inside their brain. So, you know, I really do believe that we need to read up on the tween years and have knowledge of them as well. And I know this seems quite scary and you're thinking, well, I really try, but I can't be calm and patient all the time. And neither can I. You know, I'm not some superhero. I mess up regularly too. I'm not saying I'm to be like this all the time. Actually, it's really important that you mess up and make mistakes, because we need to be able to teach our children what to do when we mess up or we're rude or disrespectful. And the best way to do that is by teaching them how we resolve problems if we're rude or disrespectful to them. So it's actually really vital to their development that we do screw up quite a lot. But the difference is, when we screw up, we need to own it, acknowledge it, accept it, and apologize and make things right. So I have a ratio that I try to aim to being a good role model 70% of the time, and not worry about the 30% of the time that I mess up, because 70% is enough. Actually, there is research that shows you only need to get it right 50% of the time. So this isn't about placing a ridiculous amount of pressure on yourself to be perfect. It's about recognizing we're only human, but try your best. So I like to remember the 5 C's when I'm talking about parenting at any age, but particularly tweens. These are things that I'd really keep in the back of my mind that I want to focus on with whatever I'm struggling with, so whatever behavior. So I want to aim to have connection. This is an age where they want to disconnect from you a little bit to explore the outside world. So I'm not talking necessarily about the physical connection if they don't want all the hugs they used to have when they were little. I'm talking about the emotional connection. I'm talking about being on their level and, you know, trying to keep that bond with them emotionally. It's about containing their big feelings. So it's about going in and turning down their gas or their electricity and putting their lid on for them when they don't have the emotion regulation or impulse control to contain their own emotions. It's about communicating well with them. And, you know, I don't know where I picked this up, but somebody said to me once, communication is much more about listening and watching than it is about you saying something. You know, we listen to reply rather than listen to understand. And we have 2 eyes and 2 ears, but only 1 mouth. That should give us a clue about how we should communicate. All too often in the tween and teen years, we focus on our mouths and we forget these. But actually, it's about what can I see that my child needs? What can I hear that my child needs? How can I get them to communicate with me? But what can I learn from their communication, from their behavior, which is ultimately just communication? So what, you know, you're being that detective again, you're watching them, you're hearing them, and you're saying, what unmet needs do they have? What do they need from me? What can I do to help? Rather than how can I go in and punish them or reward them? We need to be consistent. So this goes back to not trying to be perfect. It goes back to having compassion for yourself and realizing that you've got to have a break sometimes and a break away from them sometimes. And sometimes you need to do what you've got to do in order so that you can stay consistent. So what we want to do if we have a boundary or a discipline rule or something is we don't want to enforce it inconsistently. And that comes back, I really think, to how we take care of ourselves and our own needs. And remember what I said, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. I've found that I need so much more self-compassion, self-kindness, self-care, whatever you want to call it, the older my children have got. But I think we focus this conversation very much on parents of little kids, and actually I think it's parents of big kids who need that time and compassion for themselves more. And finally, be your kid's champion. You know, the world looks down on tweens and teens so much. There's so little support for them out there. There's so little help for them, particularly in times of sort of the recent COVID coronavirus, when I think it's disproportionately affected tweens and teens, yet all I hear politicians talk about is babies and toddlers. But also if you're in a position where family members are saying something, you need to teach him a lesson, or you're going to school like I did with my son with the fork on the chair, they need somebody to stand up and be their champion, to fight their corner, to be on their side. And when they know that you're on the side, that helps everything to it builds that connection. So just, you know, what can you do to be your child's champion? Sometimes it puts us in a very uncomfortable position when maybe what we'd want to do is to go away and be quiet and keep quiet, but our kids need us to stand up for them. What's the most important element in all of this, aside from understanding their brain, which is why I entitled this webinar, Understanding Their Brain? I think that is the most important. The second most important, or maybe as important, is you. So what do you need to do to be a great teacher for your tween? Do you need to understand more about the tween years? Do you need to reinvestigate your own upbringing and work on your triggers? Do you need some more self-kindness or self-compassion or more downtime? What is it that you need to do to be that great teacher and role model of calm that you'd like your tween to grow into? So I'm going to stop talking there. If you want to come and chat to me more about parenting in general, tweens, teens, or anything else, then come follow me. I am on Instagram with just my name, Sarah Ockwell-Smith. I do something called Ask SOS every other day, which is where you can submit a question to me and I work through them and answer them all on my Instagram page. I'm also on Facebook under just my name, Sarah Ockwell-Smith, author. I'm on Twitter. Ironically, I called myself the baby expert like 15 years ago, but I wish I could change it. Obviously I hate the term expert, it makes me feel really cringy and yucky, but obviously don't just talk about babies, but unfortunately that handle is printed in all my books, so I can't change it. Also on YouTube, loads of brief 5-minute parenting videos, and also pop this on YouTube for you to watch as well. And I have a website with loads of free blogs and articles and a newsletter I send out every month. So the last thing I would say is, if you did enjoy today's webinar, please, I'd be really grateful if you could go and look into my book called Between, a guide for parenting 8 to 13-year-olds. You can buy it anywhere that you can buy books online. Most places it's sort of 30% discount, but it covers everything in depth about understanding puberty, what happens and when, understanding their brain,